So you're just getting into reptiles and you want to pick your first pet. There's so many options. What do you choose? And that's where I got 5 recommendations for you guys. And before we get further into the video, I do want to talk about other things to consider when getting your first reptile. And one of those is the upfront cost. Now, upfront cost for a reptile could be a game breaker for you, and it could be something that's not really that big a deal for you. If you can pay that $500,000 for the reptile, as long as the daily maintenance is not too much for you, that might be the perfect reptile for you as a beginner. But for the most part, for beginners, I'd probably say that they want something that's a little bit cheaper, $100 or less, maybe $200 or less, and they can get a couple different morphs to choose from, so they're not getting the same exact reptile that everyone else has. So I just mentioned the daily or weekly maintenance of a reptile, and I think that dictates whether or not you're going to put some of these reptiles higher or lower on the list. Now, I do also want to mention availability. That's another thing that beginners need to have at least some availability. There's some species that might be excellent beginner pets, but they're just so hard to come by and they're so hard to find. You're only going to find them at big, large reptile conventions like the one we went to back in 2019, NERBC. Sadly, I haven't been able to go to a reptile convention because of the whole Rona situation. So that might be something that's even more present than it was before. So the obtainability of that reptile is really probably going to be the deciding factor for people, even more so now. Okay, and then another one I want to talk about, I don't think anyone really talks about this, but I like to call it like the Icky Factor of the reptile, which basically just means some snakes do best feeding on mice or lizards or other snakes, and that's just not something for everybody. Not everyone wants to get their hands dirty and see that process of life. That's definitely not for everybody. And along with this, are they handleable? Are they gonna gross people out? Are they gonna bite you? What I like to say, anything with a mouth is gonna be able to bite you. Your dog can bite you, your cat can bite you, your snake can bite you, your gecko can bite you. But more times than not, it's not gonna bite you unless it misses its food, and it's gonna latch right off of you. So that's a fear that people have that probably doesn't need to be there as much. I definitely know if you have a chameleon and you let all the lights turn off, you don't spray it for like a week, they could die. Like that's how urgent the care for some of these animals are. But a lot of times for these beginner ones, they're a lot more hardy, more than some of the more advanced reptiles. And then the last 2 things I really want to recommend looking into: lifespan and max size for reptiles. Because I used to work at a pet store, and people would bring in like toads, turtles. They'd be like, what do I need to do for this? I'm like, well, for this turtle, you need a filtration system, you need to feed it a different varying diet, and it's gonna live for 30, 35 years, and it's gonna get yay big. And they're like, well, I don't want this turtle. And I'm like, well, I'm glad we came to that realization before you figured that out 10 years down the line and the animal's in harm. So really, really consider, is this animal going to live 20 years? I'm going to have to make this part of the family, and you have to make that commitment. It's basically like a cat. If it can live 15 to 20 years, that's like a cat. So it's going to be less maintenance than a cat, but that's what you're doing. You're bringing someone into your family, so treat it that way. I don't know. And yeah, again, max size. Is this a boa constrictor? Is it going to be 8 feet long, or is it just going to be... But again, these are live creatures, and you do need to do research beyond this video and make sure you are fully prepared to owning this reptile before you obtain it. Number 5, ball pythons. I think they're a little bit overrated, and I think they barely make it on this list. And that's because they're really shy. They're not always the best to be handled. I know mine for sure doesn't like being handled that much. Over time, my ball python kind of opened up to me and my girlfriend, and now we can hold them every now and then. But she's just a little cage defensive, and sometimes I'd rather just leave her in the cage. So, and on top of that, our ball python, at first when we got it, it just didn't want to eat, and it took us like 2 or 3 weeks of trying, and then we finally got her to eat. And now she's eating perfectly fine. But that is something that's common in ball pythons, where they don't want to take their food, don't want to take their mice, and that's just something that I feel like you won't have with a corn snake or some of the other snakes out there that are definitely just ready to just eat. They're just ready. But for the pros of ball pythons, there's actually a lot of pros. They're pretty simple, their setup's really easy, and they have just billions of morphs. I think that's probably the biggest pro to ball pythons. You can get them in all different colors. blacks and browns and whites and basically everything you can think of. Not really, you can't find like a rainbow one, but you can find really cool ball python morphs, and there's a ton to choose from, and I do think that's important when getting a beginner pet, because you don't want to get the same pet everyone else has. You do want to stand out a little bit, at least I do. So I think that adds to your options. Numero 4 on this list is going to be beginner-friendly colubrids. I'm going to say like corn snakes, milk snakes, and some of the king snakes. But specifically like corn snakes would probably be the easiest fit, because corn snakes, they have the perks like ball pythons where you can just find all different kinds of morphs, all different kinds of colors. I'll show you this color, and this color, and they don't look the same at all, but they're the same snake. Like, if you weren't familiar with snakes, and you show that to someone, you'd be like, oh, that snake looks cooler than that snake, but they're actually the same species of snake. They're just different morphs. A lot of different colors of corn snakes. Corn snakes definitely have the options. They have that same benefit as the options, but they also are a little bit better than ball pythons because they take their food better and they have a little bit more personality, in my opinion. They're going to be moving around more, and they're a little bit more active and a little bit more playful. But the ball pythons, they're ball pythons. They just kind of chill. They're balled up in your hand, and it takes them a little while to even get used to you. So for me, I think corn snakes, they succeed where ball pythons don't, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily better or worse. It's not like when we're talking about reptiles, it's like a tech review. We're like, well, the 3DS is better than 2DS. It's definitely subjective. We're talking snakes. And again, both the ball pythons and the corn snakes are going to be like 15 to 20 years average lifespan. They're both going to need to be fed on frozen thawed mice. So that might be a make or break for some people, which is why they're kind of on the lower end of the list. And let's move on. Alright, we're at number 3. Rosy boas and sand boas. These are kind of like a unique choice because they spend most of their life under the ground in the sand, and they might actually be the easiest on this list potentially, because you only have to feed them every 7 to 10 days, at least an adult one, and they're really docile, really calm, and there's kind of not a lot more to it. They're the chillest snake you could have, and they're barely like a snake. They're just underground. They're basically like worms. You can find them pretty cheap. $70 to $100 is pretty common if you just want some basic morphs. They do have a lifespan of 25 to 30 years. Might be a make or break for some people. You do also have to feed them frozen mice. The common trend between all the snakes on this list. Dead frozen mice might not be as bad as live insects for some people, but it might not be. Depends on your preference, I suppose. They do need a hot spot of 90 to 95 degrees with one of those incandescent spot bulbs. Probably the only thing you really need for them, other than having that 20-gallon enclosure, having the spot, and just buying the upfront cost for the snake. They probably have the lowest daily maintenance of anything on this list. It definitely would not be a bad beginner reptile. Okay, number 2 on this list, leopard geckos. You probably saw this one coming. Leopard geckos, for most people, are a number 1, and I think for good reason. They're pretty easy. You just need the heat lamp, you need a cold spot on the cage so that they can adjust their body temperature based on how they want to do it. They're cold-blooded animals. They do have that lifespan of 15 to 20 years. I think just about everything on this list has about the lifespan of 15 to 20 plus years. Maybe that's just an investment you have to make for most reptiles, but leopard geckos, like the ball pythons, like the corn snakes, they're going to have a lot of different morphs to choose from. You definitely have a lot of variety, and that's definitely a pro for me. They're pretty easy to feed. You do need to feed them live dusted crickets, but I do feel like they have a lot of personality. They're one of those reptiles that could just kind of chill on your shoulder while you watch TV for a little bit, and you can put them back, and it's not going to stress them out too much. They're pretty easy to work with, pretty easy to handle, and the daily maintenance is pretty minimal, so definitely a good beginner choice. Alright guys, and for number 1 on this list, we have Coco, and Coco is a crested gecko, and I think these are the most beginner-friendly pet you could have, and they're really fun to handle. They have a lot of pros, in my opinion. They also come in a lot of different morphs. For some people, this might not be the best reptile, but some people might prefer the leopard gecko, depending on what they want. And crested geckos have a bunch of perks, and the biggest one being, you don't have to feed them insects, you don't have to feed them mice. you can just get a little Pangea powder mix that with water, and they're good. They can actually feed themselves for the next day or two. You just gotta check on them, make sure they're doing alright. But that's pretty easy. All you have to do is put their food out there and they feed themselves, basically like a cat. You don't have to hold the tongs, you don't have to shake the pinky mouse, you don't have to mess with live insects, and they definitely have the lowest icky rating or whatever you want to call it, because for some people they don't want to do that. Where are you going? They come in a lot of different varieties. This is basically just like a normal morphless crested gecko, but they come in all different colors as well. They're an arboreal gecko, I can't pronounce that word, unlike the leopard gecko where they need kind of like just like a ground setup. These guys are going to need a little bit of climbing area, a little bit of vertical space for them to navigate through their enclosure instead of just horizontal space like a leopard gecko or a snake would. Well, a not arboreal snake, you know what I mean. This is the first gecko that I owned, at least me and my girlfriend. We had other reptiles before this, but he does have kind of a special place in my heart, so I do love crested geckos. And I don't know, I think they just make a great beginner pet. But that's gonna wrap it up, guys. Let me know what you would choose if you were to get a reptile. I don't know where he's going. We're gonna have to end it soon. Alright, bye.
I know what you're trying to make him do.